He was the kilt-wearing, coconut-smashing, trash-talking Roddy Piper. One of the greatest heels in wrestling history, he could make a crowd explode with a single word. But behind the charisma and the controversy, there was a darker side to Hot Rod. Let us finally know the real Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper wasn't always a wrestling superstar. He had a tough childhood. Born Roderick George Toombs in Saskatoon, Canada, he ran away from home when he was just a teenager. He lived on the streets doing whatever he could to survive, but he was tough and he learned to fight. That's what eventually led him to wrestling. But it was Piper's Pit that really made Roddy Piper a star. This was his own talk show, right there in the wrestling ring. He would invite other wrestlers and sometimes even celebrities to be his guests, and he would just let loose. But Piper's Pit was also where some of his biggest controversies happened. Piper sometimes said things that were offensive, especially about people from different backgrounds. One of the most talked about parts of Piper's career was the way he used stereotypes in his promos to get under people's skin. A big example of this was his feud with Chavo Guerrero Sr. in Los Angeles. Piper didn't just taunt Guerrero like most wrestlers would. He played La Cucaracha on his bagpipes during matches and made offensive jokes about Mexicans in his interviews. For fans in LA, many of whom were Mexican-American, this didn't feel like just a wrestling storyline. It felt personal. It was designed to make people angry, and it worked, but it also crossed a line. What might have been seen as just part of the show back then is now widely criticized as offensive and unnecessary. Another infamous moment in Piper's career happened on Piper's Pit, his popular talk show segment. During an episode with Jimmy Superfly Snuka, Piper smashed a coconut over Snuka's head. That alone shocked fans, but the build-up to it was even worse. Piper spent the segment mocking Snuka's Polynesian background, imitating his accent, and making disrespectful comments about his culture. At the time, wrestling thrived on shock value, and moments like this were seen as entertainment. But when you look back on it now, it's clear this was rooted in racism and was hurtful, not funny. Piper's behavior wasn't just controversial in his promos, it sometimes carried over into real life. One incident that wrestling fans still talk about happened in 1997 at Slamboree. Piper had a match with Kevin Nash, and things didn't go according to plan. Reports say Piper might have been drinking, and he decided to go completely off script. Instead of sticking to the planned match, Piper turned it into a real fight. The tension between the two was real, and fans could tell something was off. What should have been a typical wrestling performance turned into a messy, chaotic scene, showing just how unpredictable Piper could be, both in and out of the ring. One of the most upsetting moments of Piper's career wasn't in the ring, but during a radio interview after Owen Hart's tragic death in 1999. Owen's passing was devastating for the wrestling community, and people were grieving. But Piper made shocking and hurtful comments, suggesting that Bret Hart, Owen's brother, was somehow to blame for the accident. He even called Bret the Bin Laden of wrestling. Fans and wrestlers alike were stunned by the insensitivity of his words. Piper later apologized, but the damage was done, and it's one of the moments that cast a shadow over his career. It's also worth mentioning that Piper faced his own personal struggles. He was open about his battles with drugs and alcohol, especially early in his career. Wrestling in the 70s and 80s was a tough business, and substance abuse was common. Piper was no exception. While this doesn't excuse some of his behavior, it helps explain why he acted the way he did at times. On top of that, Piper had a rough childhood. He ran away from home as a teenager and grew up in tough circumstances. That kind of upbringing leaves its mark, and it's clear that Piper carried some of that pain with him throughout his life. It's also important to remember the time period Piper came from. Wrestling in the 70s and 80s was very different from today. Back then, performers often relied on shock value and stereotypes to get attention. Piper was a product of that environment, and while he took it further than most, he wasn't the only one doing it. That doesn't mean it was okay. It just helps explain why it happened. For all his controversies, there's no denying that Piper was incredibly talented. He had a way of connecting with the audience that few wrestlers could match. Whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't take your eyes off him. Piper had a sharp tongue, quick wit, and an energy that made him unforgettable. He helped define what it meant to be a bad guy in wrestling, and his influence can still be seen in the business today. In 2015, the wrestling world was stunned by Piper's death. He passed away in his sleep on July 31st at the age of 61. Piper was staying at his summer home in Hollywood, California at the time. The official cause of death was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that blocked an artery in his lungs and caused heart failure. High blood pressure was also a factor, and some believe his previous battle with Hodgkin's lymphoma may have contributed. Piper had been in remission from cancer, but the treatments he went through might have increased the risk of blood clots. His death felt sudden and hit the wrestling community hard. Fans and wrestlers around the world mourned his passing. WWE held a tribute to Piper on Monday Night Raw with a 10-bell salute in his honor. Social media was flooded with stories and memories of the Hot Rod, and documentaries and specials were made to celebrate his life. Piper's impact on wrestling was undeniable, and even those who had been critical of him took time to acknowledge the mark he left on the industry. Roddy Piper's legacy is complicated. He was a man of incredible talent, someone who could entertain like no other, but he was also someone who made serious mistakes and hurt people along the way. His story is a mix of highs and lows, brilliance and regret. To truly understand him, you have to look at both sides. He wasn't just a hero or a villain. He was human, with all the flaws and contradictions that come with it. Now, if you're a big fan of Piper, regardless of his controversies, the upcoming part is only for you, because here we have the rundown of his epic career from the start till the end. Roddy Piper's life and career were anything but ordinary. He was one of the most entertaining and unpredictable figures in professional wrestling, but before all the fame and chaos, his life started in a much different place. Born Roderick George Toombs on April 17, 1954, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, Roddy had a rough childhood. His family moved around a lot, and things at home weren't always easy. By the time he was 13 years old, Roddy had run away from home, living on the streets and doing whatever he could to survive. It wasn't an easy life, but those early struggles shaped who he was: tough, rebellious, and determined. Wrestling came into his life almost by accident. As a teenager, he took up boxing and wrestling, which led him to local wrestling matches in Canada. He started out as a young kid trying to make a name for himself in small promotions, often as the underdog. His skills were solid, but what really made him stand out was his personality. Roddy wasn't the biggest or strongest wrestler, but he was quick, smart, and had a gift for getting under people's skin. That's where his character, Roddy Piper, really started to take shape. He became known for his sharp tongue and ability to rile up both his opponents and the crowd. In the 1970s, Piper started making a name for himself in regional wrestling promotions across the United States, and especially in the National Wrestling Alliance, NWA. He would come to the ring playing bagpipes, paying tribute to his Scottish heritage, and he quickly earned a reputation for being unpredictable. Whether he was taunting his opponents or trash-talking during interviews, fans couldn't take their eyes off him. Piper wasn't just a wrestler, he was a performer. Even if you hated him, you couldn't look away. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Piper's career was on the rise, and it wasn't long before the biggest wrestling promotion in the world came calling, the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, now known as WWE. Piper joined the WWF during a time when wrestling was becoming bigger than ever, and he quickly became one of their top stars. But instead of being the hero, Piper became the villain, the guy fans loved to hate. One of Piper's biggest rivalries in the WWF was with Hulk Hogan, the ultimate good guy of wrestling. Hogan was the all-American hero, while Piper was the loudmouth troublemaker who always seemed to be scheming. Their feud helped put wrestling on the map, especially during the first WrestleMania in 1985. In the main event, Piper teamed up with Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff to take on Hogan and Mr. T, the popular actor from the A-Team. It was a huge event, blending wrestling and pop culture, and Piper was right in the middle of it all. He knew how to make fans hate him, but he also knew how to make the show unforgettable. Around this time, Piper also launched his famous talk show segment, Piper's Pit. It was a space where he could really shine. Piper would invite other wrestlers onto the show, but instead of a friendly chat, it usually turned into chaos. Piper was the master of stirring things up, whether he was mocking his guest, insulting the crowd, or creating moments that people couldn't stop talking about. One of the most infamous moments in Piper's Pit history was when he smashed a coconut over Jimmy Snuka's head. It's one of those moments that wrestling fans still talk about today, and it showed just how far Piper was willing to go to keep people's attention. But being the bad guy in wrestling wasn't all Piper could do. Over time, fans started to appreciate him, not just as a villain, but as someone who brought excitement to the ring. He became more of an anti-hero, someone fans could cheer for because of his rebellious attitude and sharp wit. Piper wasn't following anyone's rules, and fans loved him for it. He wasn't trying to be perfect, he was just being himself. In the late 1980s, Piper decided to step away from wrestling for a bit to try his hand at acting. He starred in the cult classic They Live, where he played a drifter who discovers aliens are secretly controlling the world. The movie became a fan favorite. In one line from the film, "I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum," became iconic. Piper showed that his charisma and talent weren't limited to the wrestling ring, but wrestling was always in his blood, and Piper couldn't stay away for long. He returned to the WWF in the early 1990s, much to the excitement of fans. Wrestling had changed a bit, with new stars like The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels rising to the top, but Piper still had that spark. Whenever he showed up, you knew something wild was going to happen. However, as time went on, Piper's career became more unpredictable. He wrestled for other promotions like WCW and TNA, but the wrestling business was evolving, and Piper's old-school style didn't always fit with the new direction. On top of that, years of wrestling had taken a toll on his body. Piper had given so much to the business, and it started to show. Outside the ring, Piper also faced his share of personal struggles. He was open about his battles with drugs and alcohol, particularly during the early years of his career. Wrestling in the 70s and 80s was a hard lifestyle, filled with long travel schedules, physical demands, and temptations. Piper wasn't the only wrestler who struggled, but he was one of the few who talked openly about it. He also spoke about his tough childhood and how it shaped the way he saw the world. Piper's honesty about his struggles made him relatable to fans, even when his actions were controversial. By the 2000s, Piper was more of a part-time wrestler, making special appearances here and there. He became a fan favorite for nostalgic reasons, and whenever his music hit, the crowd would erupt. Piper wasn't just a wrestler anymore. He was a legend, someone who had helped shape the business into what it had become. When Piper passed away on July 31st, 2015, it was a huge loss for the wrestling world. He died in his sleep at the age of 61, and the cause was later revealed to be a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot that blocked an artery in his lungs. Piper's death shocked fans, especially because he had still been active in the wrestling community. It was hard to imagine a world without Roddy Piper. After his passing, tributes poured in from fans, wrestlers, and even people outside of wrestling. WWE honored him with a 10-bell salute, and countless people shared their favorite memories of the Hot Rod. Piper was remembered not just for his controversies or his brash personality, but for the joy and excitement he brought to wrestling fans around the world. Roddy Piper's story is one of highs and lows. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, said things he shouldn't have, and sometimes took things too far. But he also gave everything he had to entertain people. Piper wasn't afraid to be himself, flaws and all. And that's part of why fans still love him. He was a trailblazer, a rebel, and a true original. So whether you remember him as the loudmouth villain or the scrappy anti-hero, there's no denying that Roddy Piper left a lasting legacy. He showed that wrestling isn't just about moves in the ring, it's about storytelling, personality, and connecting with the audience. Piper did all that and more. Thanks for sticking around to learn more about the life and career of Roddy Piper. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more stories about the legends of wrestling. Let us know in the comments which wrestler you'd like us to talk about next, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.